and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and joining me in Wellington is senior political reporter Marc Daalder. Hi Marc.
Hello Laura. And
joining us from Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Kia ora, Tim.
Kia ora. It's wonderful to be back with you.
Now, today on Raw Politics, we examine the politics of the health system fiasco. We'll be taking a look at the conduct issues and discontent that is brewing in Parliament, and we'll be looking forward to the National Party AGM this weekend. And to wrap up, as always, we will offer you some recommendations. The health system is still in crisis. That is the admission this week from Health Minister Dr. Shane Reti. Now, last week on Raw Politics, we talked a bit about the financial fiasco happening at Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand, which is now running at $130 million a month deficit. But that isn't the end of the bad news, as we have discovered this week. It's become increasingly clear that the financial and workforce issues are putting hospitals and potentially patients in a pretty precarious position. Now, one of the examples that has been raised throughout the week is the case of Dargaville Hospital, which is being forced to close overnight due to a shortage of doctors, and it is telehealth that is having to step in to attempt to fill that gap. Now, Tim, you have followed the issues facing the health system under this government since the beginning. Of course, we do not have to cast our minds very far back to remember the kind of almost broken cancer drugs promise. What do you think on this? Is the government failing Kiwis on health?
It's an Achilles heel for this government, politically. So let me just start by addressing it as politics rather than as medical or emergency or sort of resource or service. The politics of it have bedevilled this national coalition since the start, right back to one of the weirdest things they did, and I think virtually no support in the community or no desire or demand in the community for this, but in the coalition agreements and therefore in the government arrangement, we had this change to the smoke-free position. I know it was policy for those other two parties, but there just seemed to be no demand that I could see, other than industry, tobacco industry you'd think, for that to be added. So they added that. That caused a flurry politically, which was difficult. Then we come through to a whole lot of other things, including the failure to include the cancer drug funding in the budget. They're now, having done that, saying, well, look, it was just a short delay and it was just to get things right. And so they've tried to remedy that. But the actual leaving out of those things like the cancer drugs, as we now know, was a result of a process where they were having second and third thoughts about whether they could fund it and should fund it in the budget. So there was a clear political raw nerve, and they didn't look after that, and that cost them too. Then, obviously, the funding and the Health New Zealand reforms, which we'll talk about. You guys did a great show, and I really learned a lot from it about the actual finances and the argument over the finances. All I'll add quickly is that the strategy politically of attacking that full board, and by extension its chief executive and executives, is going to be risky as well, because as we've seen, the board members who have left are going to start saying, well, no, we're not numbskulls. We're not political sort of novices, financial novices and governance novices. We were aware of problems. We were looking for this and that. And the executives somewhere, and I'm just predicting there'll be leaks here, the executives of Health New Zealand will also, some of them, somewhere, will come out showing that the cash flow issues, the reporting issues that Luxon, particularly as the former CEO, keeps talking about, actually weren't as bad as this government is painting. They might have an example from a month or a quarter, but they're over-egging that, I think, and that'll be shown as well. So, look, health is an Achilles heel politically for these guys at the moment.
And Tim, since you're talking about that funding, I mean, we dug into these details last week on Raw Politics. Marc, you've written about this at length, but we did get some more detail about this week from Nicola Willis, the Finance Minister. So I was wondering, based on what she's told us this week, do we get a clearer idea of whether there is that financial mismanagement, as National and the government is trying to paint it as, or is it an underfunding issue?
Yeah, I think it's not what Nicola Willis did tell us. It's what she wouldn't say in Parliament, asked very repeatedly whether she had given Health New Zealand the amount of money it said it needed for the budget. She did not answer that question, but she said she'd given Health New Zealand the amount of money Treasury said it needed in the budget. And those numbers are usually quite different, right? And we don't know the scale of it, and we're not likely to know the scale of it because the budget bid figures themselves are not usually released by the government, although there will be quite a lot of pressure on this one in particular. But you've got that on the one side. Almost certainly Health New Zealand submitted a budget bid saying we need money to cover these cost pressures, and they got less than they asked for. And then we've also seen this Dargaville Hospital issue crop up this week, and more revelations about other hospitals that have, while not having to resort to telehealth yet because of lack of doctors, Kinapuru Hospital just outside of Wellington has a backup plan and has almost had to do that several times recently. So, this doesn't look like a health system that is splurging money. It looks like a health system that doesn't have the money, at least where it needs to be. So there's a money issue. Maybe there's also a financial mismanagement issue, but there's a funding issue. The quantum of resource isn't there. That seems more and more clear every day.
And we know that in the area of health, there is never enough money. There could always be more. Every single government has to grapple with this, and they're making incredibly difficult trade-offs because it's, a question of life and death. But it very much seems with this government, if we are now getting a clearer picture that there could be some underfunding that is leading to this crisis, as the Health Minister has called it, and then on the other hand, we're seeing money spent in areas, like you've pointed out, Tim, that people weren't really calling for or that could potentially be detrimental to health, I think that, puts them in a politically very difficult position as well.
And politically, it's very difficult for one person, and that's Shane Reti, because the obvious, allegation or stance people take on these things is that this minister might not be in control of his portfolio and his departments and his ministry and so on. I don't yet hold that view. I think he's got all sorts of other things going on in the background, including the associate ministers he's been lumped with, one from ACT and one from New Zealand First, who are doing the smoking stuff and some of the Farm Act and some of the other things. These are people who have different agendas, different drivers. There's going to be discussions and arguments behind the scenes. I also think two things can be right of Health New Zealand. There probably has been underfunding for what they needed or wanted. And there probably hasn't been financial mismanagement. I think that is a very dangerous sort of allegation to throw around. I wouldn't think it'd be mismanagement so much as systems failures. That Luxon probably is right, that they weren't able quickly to land on and sort of bring out of their systems the numbers they needed for when things were going to go from in the red into the black into the red again. So they probably were caught out by the flows not being as clear and as clearly projected and forecast. So I think those two things would be right, that there was underfunding and there's systems issues, whether it's mismanagement and whether it's, board ignorance or ill performance is a big thing. And I think that is a political stance that he's used and others have used in the government so far against other boards, obviously Transrail, Kāinga Ora. So the board members just get dumped on from a great height, even though they're probably grappling with things that aren't of their doing. Yes, they might have put their hands up earlier, but I think it's dangerous territory politically as well.
And it's interesting in this one where the blame has fallen at the feet of the board rather than the health minister thus far. Of course, the media and the public are asking questions around, the health minister's suitability to remain in this role given the situation, but the government has not tossed Reti out. And we'll remember that not that long ago when Penny Simmons and Melissa Lee were underperforming in their portfolios, Luxon was pretty quick to kick them to the curb,
That's how he rolls.
Exactly, that's what he said. That's how I roll. He doesn't need to wait for a full portfolio reshuffle. If you're not doing the job well, you're out. The same thing has not happened with Shane Reti. I mean, there have been hints that maybe Luxon and Willis don't have full confidence in that they are showing up with him to every meeting with the new Te Whatu Ora Commissioner. which would suggest that maybe there's a bit of hand-holding and micromanaging going on there, but there haven't been any suggestions that they have lost confidence in him, at least publicly. But I do think that there are some worthwhile questions to ask around Shane Reti's performance, particularly in the inconsistency and the accuracy of the information that he has provided to his Prime Minister and also to the public. We saw some inconsistency in the messaging around cancer drugs funding back around budget time. Now we've seen those issues around the 14 layers of management, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think with Reti, just because he is a medical doctor doesn't necessarily mean he is the best person for this portfolio. It is a very difficult political role to have. Part of the job is not taking someone's blood pressure or performing CPR. He doesn't need to be a medical physician. What he needs to know is how to manage budgets in a very difficult situation. He needs to know logistics of big systems. He needs to know how to work with his board, and he needs to know how to make those really difficult trade-offs and front up politically and just take some knocks on the chin, to kind of shake it off and move on.
And I think you're right. Doctors haven't had that great a run as health ministers. Ashley Verrill didn't have much time, obviously, in hers, but you'd argue now, and certainly the other side, the National New Zealand First Act group would say that she was a failure, but she wasn't able to be completely convincing in following through on that Health New Zealand sort of setup and so on. And Jonathan Coleman under National in the 2000s, also had troubles. He was a doctor, medical doctor. So two of the best probably were lawyers, actually, and in terms of holding the portfolio together, not their policies, but in terms of a problematic area being kind of managed and kept under control. Lawyers being Andrew Little, and then back in the day, Tony Ryle for the National Government of the 90s. So, it's not an advantage necessarily to be from the medical field.
The one advantage Shane Reti has is he has actually a very easy way to close the gap at Dargaville Hospital, which is just to head over there himself and take a couple of night shifts. And
that way he gets to get away from the tough questioning in Parliament. It's kind of a win-win for Shane Reti. And just before we move on, I think we can't not talk about this 14 layers of management issue that the government has had this week. I mean, it has taken up a lot of oxygen throughout this week. For those people who are not aware, Luxon has been saying that part of the issue is bloated bureaucracy, that there are 14 layers of management in Te Whatu Ora, and then it's kind of become clear over time that number 14 also includes the patient as one of the managers, all the way up to the board chair. And so he's been really pushed on whether this is actually accurate and whether, again, he's, over-egging what the situation is.
Yeah, and Shane Reti also said one of the reasons he had installed a commissioner rather than appointing a new board was to reduce one of those layers of management, which didn't quite click for us because presumably a board and a commissioner, there's still one layer altogether. But he seemed to suggest that with fewer people on a layer, the number of layers also there's a horizontal and vertical problem going on here. But it is important, right? Because this is something that Chris Luxon and Shane Reti made a slogan for the couple of days after that first post-cabinet press conference last week of why this needed to be done. 14 layers, 14 layers, 14 layers. And then as soon as it comes up and turns out to be maybe not entirely accurate, it's suddenly, well, why are you worrying about this little thing that we said?
Luxon actually said to reporters who pushed him on it, whoop-de-doo.
Yeah, whoop-de-doo, right? Like why are you asking about us about this when there's such a bigger substantive issue? But it's the problem of using a slogan without checking it out or without thinking about the consequences. I think there's a very similar thing happening with the boot camp policy as well, right? National called it boot camps. Christopher Luxon called it boot camps. There's video of him doing it. There's audio of him doing it. And now he and all his ministers act like you're slurring them with the most horrible allegations possible if you call it a boot camp. There. and suddenly no, let me stop you. It's a military-style academy. That's fine. You can change the name, but you have to acknowledge that you did use it as a slogan. You won a by-election off of it. You went to the election on it. It's not a fiction that the media has produced here.
And I think that is the problem. Sometimes in these backwards and forwards, the government ministers start to think that it is the media versus them. That is not what's going on there. I think that they have to remember that they are speaking to New Zealanders through the media, and that it is important that they get their facts right, and when they don't get them right, that they front up and say, actually, I got it wrong. Maybe the broader point I was trying to make still stands, but yes, no, you're right. It's not 14 layers of management. Say it's 13 or it's 12. So when they think it's the media attacking them on that, it's actually trying to get the most clear and accurate and concise, I guess, information for the public, because the public want to know what the government is doing, especially in an area like health that's so vital and affects all of us.
Look, the number 14 was laughable. It's embarrassing. There's no possibility there were 14 layers anywhere like that. It's like saying that there's 14 layers between me as a voter and the Prime Minister by counting the National Party committee, the National Party electorate chairman, the MP, the regional chairman. It's just ridiculous. It throws everything at it. And okay, there might be layers of bureaucracy, but sloganising is a danger. Politically, it undermines. And part of the reason, to your discussion just before, that they, as ministers and politicians in all stripes, blanch when they get questioned by the media and journalists on these sort of inconsistencies, is because everybody around them, until that point, has been sort of all supportive and flunkies and just yes sir, no sir. And so the first occasion they come up against someone who says, is that right? That doesn't sound right. That's kind of a bit over the top. That's why they think the media is against them. But it's actually just the first point of any independent member of the public raising a question in their head. So look, sloganising's risky. It's very risky in health.
Some weeks it will not feel like it, but we are just 8 months into this parliamentary term, and Speaker of the House, Gerry Brownlee, is already losing the confidence of some members of Parliament. What's particularly unusual with this, though, is that the strongest criticism is coming from within the government. Now, things blew up in the House on Wednesday, Mark, and you were watching really closely what was going on there with that backwards and forwards with the Speaker. Can you give us a little bit of a rundown around what the issues are? Yeah,
there's kind of three big things that are kind of motivating this in terms of background to what's going on here, this dispute between David Seymour, ACT Party leader, and Gerry Brownlee, the Speaker. It starts with bad blood between ACT and Te Pāti Māori. Te Pāti Māori MPs have been making quite personal comments about ACT Party ministers, particularly ACT Party Minister Karen Chor, the Children's Minister, a lot of attacks on her sort of upbringing and heritage as a Māori minister, but a Māori minister who is, in their view, deploying policies that are harmful to Māori. Comments about her to the effect of kind of betraying Māori, right? Those have been things that David Seymour has complained about. He doesn't feel like the Speaker has cracked down on it hard enough. There was also a situation with a select committee, a subcommittee, which was being formed to consider the bill on the changes to Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act, basically to remove the treaty references from that act. And ACT MP Laura Trask, who's not Māori, was put up as the potential chair. And allegedly, Seymour says a Māori Party MP, Māori Ameno Kapa Kingi, objected to this on the basis that Trask was not Māori, so shouldn't be chairing a committee that was looking at this issue. She was made chair in the end, and Green MP Kahurangi Carter was also looped into this discussion, and Seymour says made similar comments, although she says she just didn't think Trask had the experience to be running a committee. Seymour wrote to, the ACT Party whip Todd Stevenson wrote to Gerry Brownlee, saying he thinks this is a matter of privilege, should go to the Privileges Committee, the very powerful Privileges Committee that Parliament has, and that the MPs in question should be punished. He called it racial harassment, racial discrimination. We don't know exactly what Gerry Brownlee's response was because ACT won't release that. They said that's for Gerry to release, but David Seymour said it was pretty disappointing. He sought to table his own letter in Parliament. That was rejected on Wednesday afternoon, and after that, the lapel pingate broke out, which was yet another saga where ACT MP Cameron Luxton pointed out in the House last week that Māori Party MP Hana Maipi Rafiri Clark had a Māori Party sticker on her laptop. There are rules against sort of party logos in the House, so he said that should be removed. And then it was pointed out that many, not all, but many ACT MPs wear a little ACT Party pin on their lapel as well. Gerry Brownlee has come to the decision that these should also be taken off and started enforcing that on Wednesday.
Which is a new ruling.
It is.
So in the past, there are bigger slogans or, party paraphernalia that has been not allowed, like the New Zealand first flags. Yeah. But these little pins in the past have been allowed.
Explicitly allowed
David
by
Seymour has always worn his.
Yeah, and so Gerry Brownlee wouldn't let any MP take a question or ask a question if they were wearing one of these pins. It meant that Seymour's question was skipped. It meant that National Party Minister Louise Upston answered in place of Karen Chor a question.
And it was quite an interesting backwards and forwards there, where Karen Chor stood to answer the question, no, you need to sit down. Seymour tried to stand and answer it on her behalf, no, you need to sit down. And in the meantime, Kahurangi Carter asked the question about 4 or 5 times before Louise Upston stood and tried to, get into this really thorny policy area on the fly.
Yes. There are serious issues at play here, but it does sound a little bit high school when you recite it all. David Seymour came out of the House on Wednesday basically pretty furious, asked about what had happened. He said it was disgraceful and that this sort of racial harassment, in his view, was going on in Parliament and hadn't been stopped. That MP Laura Trask hadn't been offered any words of comfort by Gerry Brownlee. He was asked how he thought Gerry Brownlee had conducted himself in the House, whether he was across the standing orders, and suggested maybe Gerry Brownlee would be more across the standing orders if he opened the book, which is quite a strong attack. Yeah, Gerry's of course the longest serving MP currently in Parliament, been here a long time. He has, I think, when we'll talk about this a little bit, struggled to deal with the details of standing orders, but also some of the basic ones. I mean, on Wednesday, Chloe Swarbrick tried to table a document, and Gerry Brownlee initially prevented her from doing so for a reason that isn't in standing orders, and then later came back and said, actually, you can do that. This is pretty basic stuff. Us in the gallery, we're watching this, and we're like, I'm not sure that's how that works. And yes, we spend a lot of time watching Question Time, but we're not experts by any means, and it still flagged a flag for us as well.
So it seems like there's kind of questions around Gerry Brownlee knowing and enforcing the basic rules, as well as this kind of layering up of context around the Act versus Te Pāti Māori, and whether Gerry Brownlee is doing his job as the Speaker to kind of diffuse that situation or make sure that there's some kind of fair refereeing going on, and at least in David Seymour's view of that.
And this difficult position that we've talked about in the past of the Speaker also as kind of an employer, right? Or having some sort of pastoral and employer responsibilities to members of Parliament. And how do you do that while also, fairly judging the actual politics that goes on in the chamber? It's a complicated position that Gerry is in, I appreciate, even if some of the other criticism of him around the standing orders knowledge and that sort of thing is a little bit kind of more straightforward, maybe.
So maybe one of the most difficult jobs in Parliament. What do you reckon, Tim, is compared to other speakers, and, based on all of these things, do you think that Gerry is doing a good job, or does he need to sort himself out?
I'm going to come into bat for Gerry. Look, I think he does know the standing orders pretty well. I've been watching a lot of those Question Times, and I think there have been many issues where he's been quickly able to rattle back a number of a rule where the Parliament has already agreed, and it's the Speaker's rulings or standing orders. So I think he's probably as good at that as many. I do think, though, and I also think he lets things run in the House. He's easygoing generally. People make small, smart points, and he doesn't overreact. He kind of just says, oh, you're saying that, well, I'm saying something else. He cuts verbose politicians short, which has got to be welcome. I think, though, on this thing, it's a matter of one of those issues of pride and, I'm the top dog here. We've had a business committee that's talked about these lapel symbols. Really, they need to get out of that they should be allowed to have a small lapel thing any more than, all of them wear ferns. Prime Ministers and others always wear those things. I just don't think that's an issue that anyone in the public would think ought to be seen as indecorous for Parliament or not respectful or not abiding by, they're not glaring logos and slogans and things. So I think Gerry probably needs to come back from that. ACT won't. They love a thing like this to be the sort of hard done by outlier, and they'll milk it for all it's worth. But I think in general, he has been pretty good for the House. Now, I think you said, Laura, he's also got other much broader responsibilities than just chairing the House and the Chamber, and that's true. So we only, I guess, see him doing that, not running the Business Committee or lots of other management of Parliament and the Parliamentary Service and everything else that he has responsibility for. So.
And that is the difficult thing, isn't it? We see certain things play out in the House and we think, oh, maybe that's an overreaction to what happened just there in that exchange, but there's all of these other things happening behind closed doors. And while you make the point, Tim, that, ACT love an issue like this, they'll milk it, they'll put their stake in the ground, they won't back down. And I would usually agree with you on that. And I do agree in terms of the lapel pins. And I mean, David Seymour's not going to take his off. I reckon he sleeps with it on, honestly. I never see him somewhere without that lapel pin on. But he's not just making a political point this week. He is clearly angry. David Seymour is riled up. He thinks that Karen Shaw and Laura Trask have been very poorly served by this Parliament, and he thinks that the Speaker should have stepped in and done something in terms of that pastoral care. Now, David Seymour has been honestly a little bit snippy the past couple of days with reporters, and he'll always hit back and he's quick, but you can tell that he's a bit riled up. He's lost his cool, and that is not very normal for David Seymour. When reporters have been asking questions around this, he's questioned their questioning. Just this morning, just on Thursday morning, there were questions around, Karen Shaw has been quite upset throughout this whole process. What Marc was talking about earlier, questions around, her loyalty to Māori, to her whakapapa. And by all accounts, that's pretty nasty stuff. And, it's bullying, it's playing the player rather than, the game or the policy. Karen Shaw has been seen in corridors crying. She was quite affected last week after the Royal Commission report. She was crying in the chamber there. And there were questions from reporters this morning about whether she should take leave, whether that would be best for her to take some time away. Seymour's response is, are you fucking kidding me? Are you seriously going to ask that question? Does she, as the person being bullied in this Parliament, is it up to her to then leave her place of work? And so he was clearly, the fact that he used that language, he was clearly very upset, and he, was attacking reporters who were asking what kind of what is ACT's duty of care? What kind of support have they been wrapping around their MPs? He's assured everyone that, he's looking after these MPs who have been, navigating this. But it does raise, questions, I guess, around the Speaker's role in this as well, and more broadly around conduct in Parliament. Of course, this is not a new issue. We have a code of conduct, and Marc, you were pointing out earlier today that I think it was ACT was the only party that hasn't actually signed up to this code of conduct so far. So,
Yeah. I also just think it's worth noting, parties clash with speakers, including governing parties and MPs. That does happen. But this is quite a big statement for only 8 months into the term for David Seymour to say, yes, I still have confidence in Gerry Brownlee, but it's falling by the day. So I've got some quotes written down here. The Donald Trump of New Zealand politics, the biggest liability to democracy since Muldoon, and hands down the worst speaker in New Zealand history. Those are all things that David Seymour said and wrote about Trevor Mallard as speaker, who he suggested yesterday maybe was better than Gerry Brownlee. So, who knows what will happen? Maybe David will take a bit of a chill pill, and maybe some of these issues will be worked out in a calmer fashion behind the scenes. But the kind of tension here is quite high, and for this early in a term, for a member of the governing coalition, it's not just a confidence in supply or cooperation agreement. He's a coalition partner, right? He's going to be the Deputy Prime Minister in less than a year, and he's saying, Gerry Brownlee's Speaker for now, but won't say whether he thinks Gerry Brownlee will be Speaker by the end of the term.
And what do you think, Tim? I mean, we've talked about, Gerry, but in terms of this broader conduct issue that's leading to all of this, or seems to be leading to all of this, what do you think? I mean, it's not new. Will it ever change? How could it change?
Well, things are very sensitive, broader than the individuals, and that's what's probably leading the Māori Party to just talk as they do about Karantua and for ACT to react the way they are. The sensitivities are in reverse as well, and probably you could put a bit of that at Gerry's feet as well, the responsibility for not calming, say, Winston Peters and Shane Jones and their attacks back on Te Pāti Māori, the radical party as they keep calling them now. But it's not just the political slogans. They've been very personal about the youngest of the caucus and about Rawiri Waititi as well. There's a lot of personal stuff going each way. And I think probably, and hearing what you've said as well, Laura, that is one area of vulnerability for Gerry, is I think he needs to probably rein in all of those who are targeting the individuals opposite. And targeting beyond their questions or their answers that they're giving in question times or say the general debate. There probably is some room there too, actually. And no one wants to see individuals in the manner that you've said. Some of them are being affected, and Seymour's probably right. It shouldn't be the person victimised who has to step away. So someone needs to get together.
This weekend, National Party faithful will gather in Auckland for the party's AGM. By all accounts, the party has remained pretty upbeat. They're talking about how Christopher Luxon's government is getting stuff done and it's happening at pace. And so they're all pretty happy with the policy agenda that the government is pushing through. So, what will they be discussing at the AGM this weekend? Most likely it'll be a whole lot of pats on the back for each other. But I sat down with National Party President Sylvia Wood a few weeks back and had a bit of a chat to her around what's happening within the party organisation itself and her views looking forwards. It seems that while a lot of other parties, especially kind of Labour and the Greens, have been looking more outwardly to membership to play a bigger role in party decision-making, policy development, things like that. The National Party over recent years has kind of done the opposite thing. More power has been concentrated in the hands of National Party HQ and also the MPs in Parliament. And the membership has been, a little bit upset about that. They've thought, what's the point in becoming a member if you don't actually have a say on the direction of the party, if you can't develop some policy or at least have a say in that yourself? So there are some proposals to change the way that the National Party membership develops policy, to make sure that it's good, robust policy, to make sure those members have more of a say. But there are also a lot of other rule changes that are going to be up for discussion this weekend, things like upping the electorate office levies and the fee, basically, that candidates have to pay in order to run. I imagine that there will be some pushback from membership based on the people that I've spoken to, but it's very clear that while, National Party HQ wants a very professionalised party, they want to have hold of that, have control there, that the party membership more broadly wants to have more of a say, and they need to be thinking about that desire if they want to continue to have, a broad membership and have people sign up to the party. It's invaluable to have broader party membership, and, there's been a bit of a trend in recent years that membership has been shrinking in political parties across the board. So those will be some of the things to watch this weekend. More generally, what do you think is going to be, I guess, the vibes up in Auckland in your neck of the woods when National Party faithful gather, Tim?
They'll be happy. They won't be thinking things are perfect, but after 6 years of seeing the other side virtue signal and trash their kind of approach, their thinking, their ideas going sideways and off the agenda, one way or the other, imperfectly with this three-way coalition, the kinds of itches that are being scratched by this coalition are the itches that used to come up at these conferences. So, their things are being addressed, they're having a voice, their guys are in there, their sort of people, as they would say, are now in power. I think it'll be not buoyant, but a very satisfied, hopeful probably of improved delivery and communications and a more relaxed and comfortable and confident Prime Minister than we've had. But I think in general they'll be satisfied.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you have watched, read or listened to this week that you have enjoyed. Mark, let's start with you.
I'm recommending Dave Williams' excellent piece on Newsroom about Nicola Willis and the decision she had to make on a waste-to-energy facility. It's kind of a lot of the fast-track issues that we've been talking about brought into that. Good read. Lovely. And Tim, what have you got for us?
Well, I was going to say something else, but I've changed now because I've read your piece, Laura, on all the changes at the top of the public service since this government took power and the ones that are coming. And it's a very good read. It really does show, it steps back and shows a sort of a current and a trend that is represents a pretty profound change. So I'd recommend that.
Oh, thanks, Tim. My one for this week is non-newsroom. It is The Guardian's two-part analysis with some in-depth interactive elements looking at the coalition government's policies that are expected to affect Māori. I think it is well worth a read, and that interactive itself is quite unique, and so I would recommend going and having a play around with that. That is it from Raw Politics this week. Thank you to our producer, Trent Doyle, and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you may have to laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.